Professor Quinn back in to the meeting. Can everyone hear me okay? Okay, great. Ms. Riggs, Mr. Thompson, Mr. Cox, do I have the go-ahead from all parties ready to proceed?
Thank you, Your Honor. We're ready.
Yes, Your Honor, we're ready.
And so are we.
Great. Mr. Patterson, are you prepared to resume your cross-examination of Professor Quinn?
I am, Your Honor.
Professor Quinn, can you hear me okay?
I can, Your Honor.
Very well, then it looks like everyone's here. And for the record, we'll officially open court back up. And if there are no matters to take up prior to resuming the cross-examination, and not seeing any, Mr. Patterson, you may ask your next question.
Thank you. I'd like to go back to your report and look at Table 6 again on page 36, which is what we were looking at before the lunch break.
Okay, I'm going to turn to my hard copy. You said Table 6?
Yes, on page 36. Are you there?
Yes, I am.
Okay, great. So I just wanted to ask a clarifying question about this data. So it shows, I guess, sequentially how much your no match list reduces as you add in various files. Is that an accurate characterization?
Yes, I believe it is.
Now, just to be clear, this, for example, for school IDs, this is not showing the total number of matches with school IDs, but rather the matches to the 525,258 that were on the no match list before you added the school IDs. Is that right?
So I believe the question was whether the additional matches coming in from the school IDs are after the agency IDs and everything above.
Yeah, it may have been an artfully worded question. I guess what I'm trying to say is that you're not matching the school IDs with the voter file, but rather with the no matches that were left after agency IDs. Is that right?
I believe the school IDs were actually matched to the voter file, but what's being reported are the incremental matches, right, in addition to the steps above.
Okay, but so I guess what I'm saying is are you reporting anywhere here how many total matches there were between the school IDs and the voter file?
So in other words, how many individuals matched on the school ID, but also matched on, say, the DMV issued ID?
Yeah, correct. Or a simpler way to put it is just how many matches between the school IDs and the original voter file, notwithstanding any other IDs.
In this table, no. I'm not certain if that number is reported somewhere else in the report, though.
Okay, but this report just is, or this table is just showing the incremental matches of everything beneath the DMV file, no mover files. Is that right?
So so for instance, if we look at the last row,
Mhm.
6,747,103.
Yes,
Those are the total number of matches, including everything, all of those
Right.
forms of ID.
right. So it's not that there were 6,747,103 matches between the school IDs and the voter file. It's that there were that many matches between all your files in the voter file. Is that right?
That's correct.
Okay. That, as we've discussed, based on your Curry analysis, you believe that U.S. passports would be the most important form of other ID for adding new matches. Is that right?
Based on what I saw from Curry, yes.
Okay. And as we also discussed, you looked at data from the American National Election Study. Is that right?
That's also correct.
Okay. Let's turn to paragraph 150 of your report, where you discuss that data. Okay. I'm sorry.
I'm there, yes.
Okay, great. Is the American National Election Study sometimes referred to as the acronym ANES?
Yes, it is.
Okay. In the second sentence of paragraph, or actually, let's look in the third sentence. It says, in the most recent 2016 survey, 38 of 107, 35.5% white North Carolina respondents stated that they had an unexpired passport, while 6 of 41, 14.6% Black North Carolina respondents stated that they had an unexpired passport. Is that right?
That's what the report states there, yes.
Okay. I'd like to bring up an exhibit. We've marked this LX 178, and this is from the American National Election Studies website. And there's a question, so the FAQ page. The question is, does ANES provide data that is representative at the state level or any smaller geographic level? And then the answer is, we use a sampling methodology that is scientific and probability-based, but is intended to be representative nationally, not at the state level. It can be used to study different subpopulations, education, race, gender, at the national level if there are enough cases available in the subpopulations of interest. But we would not recommend using our data for representative state-level analyses or for analyses at any smaller geographical level, or geographic level, I'm sorry. Now, you used the American National Election Study data for a state-level analysis, correct?
Before I answer that question, the current exhibit is zoomed in. I can't read the entire.
Okay. Sure.
Thank you.
And if you could zoom out maybe one more even, so you can see the whole page. Maybe scroll up so we can see the top. Have you had a chance to look at this exhibit, Professor Quinn?
I think I've seen this before. I still can't read the sentences that you read previously.
Okay.
But no, if that's your representation, that's fine.
Okay, so you used the American National Election Study data for a state-level analysis, correct?
I did.
Were you aware at the time you conducted your analysis that the American National Election Study is not intended to be representative at the state level?
I knew the American National Election Study is designed to be representative at the national level. I think the question you're driving at is whether the 2.4 ratio that I use in the report, whether that's an accurate measure based on what's, I think, being seen here in this exhibit. So the important thing to note about that is that when the survey researchers behind the ANES state that it's not designed to be used for state-level analyses, they mean that in a very technical sense. at the national level, right, under some assumptions, the quantities that you can recover from the full survey are going to be unbiased for population quantities at the national level. What they're saying is at the state level, there's no guarantee of that kind of unbiasedness anymore. The issue with how I used it in this analysis is not whether it's the perfect measure. It's really about what sources of information are available about passport possession among North Carolina voters. And this is one of the few sources of information that we have about unexpired passport possession among North Carolina voters. And so when the survey researchers behind the ANES state that it's not designed to be used at the state level, what they're saying is that those particular fractions that I'm getting from the white North Carolina respondents and the Black North Carolina respondents, those particular fractions may not necessarily be exactly right on average, but the 2.4% number that I'm using is not important that it's not 2.4%, but the ratio, the black-white ratio of 2.4. And these particular fractions or percentages in my report, 35.5% and 14.6%, is the important thing is not whether that's exactly 35.5% or 14.6%, or the ratio of those two things is exactly 2.4. Really what I'm using this for is to demonstrate that white North Carolina voters are much more likely to possess unexpired passports than Black North Carolina voters. That's the key takeaway. As I discussed in my testimony earlier, in order for passports to erase the racial disparity that I'm seeing in my matches, it would need to be the case that the new matches coming in are disproportionately among Black voters, which is at odds with this fact that white voters are much more likely to possess unexpired passports than Black voters in North Carolina.
Well, if a survey is not representative of a given population, that means you cannot generalize its results to that population, correct?
This is a technical claim. So the claim is not that there's no information whatsoever in, to be clear, what the researchers from the ANES are saying is not that there's no information whatsoever in the respondents from a particular state, say North Carolina. What they're saying is that the sort of statistical guarantees that you would ordinarily have are no longer available to you to guarantee that something is going to be unbiased or correct on average across repeated samples from that same population.
Right. And so what I'm asking you is that if a survey is not representative of a particular population, that means that you cannot generalize its results to that population. Is that correct?
So if the claim is, do I have strong reason to believe that the exact fraction of white North Carolina voters who have unexpired passports at the time that this survey was taken is exactly 35.5%? I don't think that's exactly correct. The same thing with the Black percentage, 14.6. I don't think that's exactly correct either. But in some sense, that's not what's necessary for the analysis. The key takeaway here is that regardless of whether the ratio of white passport possession to Black passport possession is 2.4 or 2, 1.3, 2.7, all of those things will be insufficient to erase the racial disparity that I observed.
I appreciate all of that, but I would still like an answer to the question that I asked, which is that if a survey is not representative of a given population, that means you cannot generalize its results to that population, correct?
Objection, asked and answered.
Just 1 second. The objection's overruled. You may answer the question.
So I'll try to answer this again, and if I'm misremembering exactly how you phrased the question, please correct me.
Well, let me just before you start, let me phrase it again so we're on the same page. And I'm not asking about this particular survey. I'm just, as a matter in your expertise as a person expert in statistics, if a survey sample is not representative of a given population, that means you cannot generalize its results to that population. Is that correct?
So there's a distinction there, and I want to try to be clear about this. So what you're asking is whether it's possible to generalize from the sample to the population. I think it is still possible to generalize from the sample to the population in the situation you stated. The issue, though, is really about what kind of guarantees you have about the quality of that generalization from the sample to the population. And so as you set it up, if the sample is not representative of the population or is not drawn in some known way with a different probability scheme that's understood and known, you lose the guarantees of what would happen across repeated samples. And in particular, you lose the guarantee that the results would be unbiased, which is a technical term, which means that it's correct on average. In some samples, fraction would be too high. In other samples, the fraction would be too low. But if you took a number of random samples of the same size from the same population, if the results are unbiased, you'd get the correct average on the correct answer on average across that large number of hypothetical random samples. That's what you would lose by not having a representative sample.
Okay, so if I understand, you lose the ability to say that when generalizing, you get an unbiased result. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. And did you know at the time you conducted your analysis that the American National Election Study is not intended to be representative at the state level?
I knew it was intended to be representative at the national level.
Did you know it was not intended to be represented at the state level?
I knew it was not designed to be used at the state level.
Okay, and you don't disclose that in your report, correct?
I'm not certain whether I do or not.
All right, if we go back to paragraph 150, if we could bring that back up. Your report, in that same sentence we were looking at, the percentage of Black North Carolinians who have a passport is based on a survey sample size of 41. So if that number 6 out of 41 changed, just not a great amount, that could have a big impact on that percentage. Is that correct?
What I can tell you is that I tested the null hypothesis that those two proportions are equal to each other. And the resulting p-value, if I recall correctly, was about 0.02, which is quite small. It's below the usual 0.05 threshold for significance, which suggests that that is in fact a real difference between those two proportions.
Right, but I guess what I was getting at, though, is if there's some bias between the sample and the population, it wouldn't have to be biased very much to potentially change that number substantially. Is that right?
I'm not certain what you're using the term substantially. That's not a term of art that I'm aware of, and I'm not sure what that means.
Okay, I guess just what I'm getting at is if there's a bias and it said, say, the bias resulted in the representative sample, there would be 3 more African Americans with a passport and 3 fewer white North Carolinians with a passport, those percentage differences would look a lot closer. Is that correct?
So if the hypothetical is if the 38 if 38 drops from something, right, from 38 to something less than that, and there's still 107 in the denominator, that the percentage will be lower. The 35.5 percentage will be lower. And I think the other hypothetical you suggested was if the 6 Black respondents who have passports, if that's increased from 6 to something larger, then the 14.6 percentage would increase as well. I mean, that's logically true, yes.
Now, the relevant question for each form of ID is the percentage of African American voters who have that form of ID, but no other form of qualifying ID. That number helps determine the marginal impact the inclusion of that particular form of ID has on the racial disparity in ID possession overall, correct?
I believe that's language from my rebuttal report. Is it useful for me to look at the rebuttal report? Would you like me to point me to that, or is?
I'm just asking if you agree with that statement.
So I believe the statement was what one would ideally want to know is the essentially the number of incremental matches from using say passports after the other forms of ID have been looked at. Is that a fair restatement of what you said?
Well, I'll restate exactly what I said. The relevant question for each form of ID is the percentage of African American voters who have that form of ID, but no other form of qualifying ID. That number helps determine the marginal impact the inclusion of that particular form of ID has on the racial disparity in ID possession overall. I'm asking you to agree with that statement as stated.
So ideally, one would want to know how many voters who are on the no match list would move to the match list based on a new form of ID, whether that's passports, military IDs, veterans IDs, etc. In a perfect world, that's what you would want. But again, as I've testified earlier, we are not in a perfect world in this situation, and I wasn't given access to those forms of ID, so I couldn't calculate those quantities in this case.
Okay, well, I would like to bring up your rebuttal report at JX 6987, paragraph 77. Okay, and here you are critiquing Professor Callinan's expert report, is that right?
Yes, that is correct.
Okay. And
Also,
you
for the
state,
record, I'm looking at the hard copy version of this.
Understood. And you state that Dr. Callinan also repeatedly ignores the relevant empirical inquiry. The relevant question for each form of ID is the percentage of African American voters who have that form of ID, but no other form of qualifying ID. That number helps determine the marginal impact the inclusion of that particular form of ID has on the racial disparity overall. But Dr. Callinan does not engage with that analysis. Instead, he repeatedly offers information about the percentage of African Americans within a certain group of ID. He is unable to connect this number to the impact of the voter ID law at issue. Now, your use of the American National Election Study, you were offering information about the percentage of African Americans within the group of passports, correct?
No, I was actually making a claim about the fraction of passport holders within the group of African American voters and the fraction of passport holders within the group of white voters.
Okay, but you are stating the percentage that African Americans and whites have passports, not African Americans and whites without other forms of qualifying ID that have passports, correct?
So the information I'm using from the American National Election Study tells me something about the fraction or percentage of African American voters who have an unexpired passport, and something about the fraction or the percentage, depending on whether we multiply by 100, of white voters who have an unexpired passport. But I think if it's useful, it might be useful for me to try to clarify some differences between what Professor Callanan was doing and what I was doing within the sensitivity analysis where the National Election Study data gets used.
That's okay. If your counsel wants to do that on redirect, that would be fine. Now, you did not look at any other data on passport possession than the American National Election Study, correct?
I looked at State Department data, but they don't break things down by race.
Okay. If we turn to paragraph 151 of your report.
The main December report.
The main December report, yes, thank you.
Paragraph 151.
Paragraph 151, yes.
Okay, I have it on the hard copy.
Okay, and I'm going to start reading where it's bold and in italics. So you say, it is implausible that we'll go down to the next page, consideration of other IDs will eliminate the racial disparity in ID possession if A, US passports are the predominant form of other ID that will create new matches to records in the North Carolina voter file, and B, white voters are 2.4 times more likely than black voters to possess an unexpired US passport. Now for that condition B, your only data source for white voters being 2.4 times more likely than black voters to possess an unexpired US passport is a survey of a non-representative sample of North Carolina voters that does not control for whether those voters have other forms of ID. Is that right?
The 2.4 number comes from the American National Election Study.
So is your answer to my question yes?
I believe I've already testified that the American National Election Study is representative at the national level. Was there another part to the statement?
Yes, and it also does not control for whether those respondents have other forms of qualifying ID.
I would quibble with the word control just because that is a term of art in my world. So I'm not sure what control means. I'm not tabulating the NES results based on any other form of ID, if that's what the question is.
Right, so the ANES results are not limited to voters who lack other forms of qualifying ID, right?
No.
Now, would you expect African American and white voters who lack all other forms of qualifying ID to be more likely to have a similar passport possession rate than African Americans and white voters when you don't account for whether those voters have other forms of qualifying ID?
So as I have testified previously, when I did have access to the individual level passport data in the Curry litigation, I didn't tabulate ID possession, passport possession by race. And so I don't know with any degree of certainty what the relevant table would look like if we were to tabulate passport possession by, say, DMV issued ID possession by race. I don't know the answer to that question.
Now, you did not look at any data on the extent to which African American or white voters in North Carolina possess military or veteran IDs, correct?
I don't think I did. No, I don't think I saw anything that was broken down by race.
Now, you also, in your report, you discussed North Carolina voter identification cards. Is that right?
Yes, the SB issued free IDs, correct?
Yes, that's right.
Yes.
And your conclusion is that at the time you conducted your no match analysis, the provision of North Carolina voter identification cards had not mitigated the observed racial disparity in a no match list, correct?
The free IDs had not mitigated the racial disparities in the no match list. Yes.
Okay. But you've made no attempt to determine whether North Carolina voter identification cards will in the future mitigate any racial disparity in qualifying IDs if SB 824 is allowed to go into effect, correct?
So a couple things here. So as I've testified earlier, I wasn't asked to speculate about things into the future. I was asked to think about things at a particular time point. That said, right, there are some things about the free ID issuance that at least are suggestive that they may not have a huge effect in the future. Primarily is the small number of people who tried to get one of those IDs. But even more importantly than that is the fact that the fraction of those individuals, I believe there were around 2,000 individuals who received one of those free IDs. Only about 200 of those, or around 10%, were actually individuals who didn't have some other qualifying form of ID. And so that's at least some evidence that this may not have a huge impact in the future.
Now, you're aware that SB 824 has been enjoined since December 2019, correct?
I believe that's the correct date.
North Carolina voter identification cards have not been available since that time, right?
I believe that's correct.
And North Carolina voter identification cards have not been available within 2 months of an election in North Carolina, correct?
I think that's also correct.
And North Carolina voter identification cards have not been available during one-stop early voting, when under SB 824 they can be obtained and immediately used to vote with, correct?
I think that's a logical consequence of the earlier answer. So yes.
And you have not studied the issuance of free voter IDs in other states that have them, correct?
That's not something that I've looked at.
So you do not know whether in other states free voter IDs tend to be issued more frequently close to an election, correct?
I have no information on that.
All right, if we look, let's bring up paragraph 45 of your report. Okay, and here you're discussing the free IDs, and if we look at the second sentence, you say this leaves 205 people who are in the voter file are alive and do not already have a valid DMV issued ID. 89 of these 205 people are white, and 85 are black. So this means for the information that you have of people on your no match list that were alive, don't have a DMV issued ID, about 41.5% of the people who got the free voter IDs were African American. Is that right?
So you're dividing 85 by 205?
Yes.
That should be about 41.5. If that's your representation, I'm happy to go with it.
And that's almost exactly twice the rate of African Americans in the voter file you were using. Is that right? And we can look at table 7 on page 37 has that percentage.
Approximately, yes.
Yeah. Yeah. So African American voters to date on your no match list, or who were on your, strike that question. So African American voters to date who do not match to a DMV ID have been about twice as likely to obtain North Carolina voter identification cards than their prevalence in the North Carolina voter file would suggest, correct?
If one wants to use these 205 non-randomly selected individuals for that purpose, that would be correct. The problem I would have with that claim is that these individuals who have received the free ID to this point are almost certainly not representative of the broader population of North Carolina voters, nor of the individuals who are likely to take advantage of the free ID provision in the future. Even if one did want to make the case that that 41% number is the right number, right? That requires an assumption that these 205 individuals, excuse me, are representative of the people who would get the free ID in the future. But that also has an implication that the fraction of individuals who would benefit from this, who don't already have some other form of ID, the percentage of those people who would benefit from this provision would be around less than 10%, right? Because only 205 out of over 2,000 in this data set that we saw actually are those individuals who don't have some other form of ID. And so I guess what I would say is, first of all, I would question whether this group actually is representative, these 2,000 people who took up the free ID. But even if one does want to make that, I think, very strong assumption that these 2,000 people are representative of individuals who would get the free ID at some point in the future, that would also have an implication that only about 10% of those people who would get it in the future would actually need it or would be able to use it to vote because they don't have some other form of ID.
Now, in your sensitivity analysis on passports, as we just discussed, you used a non-representative sample of 148 North Carolinians, correct?
I don't recall what the exact number was, but something around 148.
That's even less than the 205 here, correct?
So the numbers are less, but I think it's important to think about the reasons for the unrepresentativeness. In the American National Election Study, individuals are still being randomly selected in North Carolina. Right? The claim is not that there's non-random selection. The issue is really about having guarantees about the properties of state-level estimates. In the other example, looking at the 2,000 people who got one of the free IDs, there's nothing random about that at all. These are individuals who are very different than voters typically. If you think about who is likely to take up this form of ID in this time window that you identified, There are a number of reasons to think that those individuals are self-selecting into that group in ways that aren't going to be true for the broader population over a longer period of time.
You have no basis for quantifying how many North Carolina voter identification cards would be issued moving forward if SB 824 goes into effect, correct?
I don't know how many free IDs would be issued in the future. That's not something I know.
And you also have no basis for concluding that the proportion of North Carolina voter identification cards issued to African Americans on your no match list would go down if SB 824 goes into effect, correct?
I'm sorry, could you repeat the question? I want to make sure I understand what's going down.
Okay, yes. So we found that proportion 85 out of 205 that were issued to people on your no match list, 85 were African American. You have no basis for any conclusion that that proportion would go down if SB 824 were to go into effect. Is that right?
I don't know that it would go down. The point I was making earlier is that if one does want to view that 41.5% number that you used as something at least approximating a meaningful number, that requires an assumption, and that assumption is that these 2,000 individuals are representative of the set of individuals who would get a free ID at some point in the future. And that assumption also implies that the fraction of individuals who would be able to vote only because of the free ID is about 10%, or actually a little bit less than 10%.
Just so I'm clear, you have no basis for thinking that fraction would go down, that were issued to African Americans. Is that right?
I don't know whether that fraction would go down.
Okay. Now, your report also discusses U.S. or state public assistance program IDs, correct?
Yes.
And it is your understanding that the North Carolina State Board of Elections is unaware of any specific IDs that qualify under Section 10 of HB 1169 for use in voting that would not have qualified for use in voting before the law passed, correct?
That's my understanding, yes.
Okay, and your understanding is based on testimony of Director Karen Brenson Bell, is that right?
I believe that's the correct person. It's a deposition, yeah.
Okay, well, let's look at paragraph 70 of your report before we bring up the deposition, just to make sure we're on the same page here about what it's based on. Okay, you could zoom in there. And so then you have this statement about your understanding, and then there's a footnote. If we go down, it says, the North Carolina State Board of Elections deposition by Karen Brenson Bell at page 54, line 10, December 3rd, 2020. Is that right?
Yes, that's right.
Okay. And let's go to Director Bell's deposition. Okay, and here is where there's a question, and I'm sorry, this is LX 128. This is an excerpt from the deposition of the 30B6 deposition of Karen Brenson Bell. And the question is, so what I'm trying to get at is whether or not, if you could give me some examples of sorts of public assistance IDs that are covered by HB 1169, Section 10, a specific example of a particular ID. And the answer is there's a different, so we've done a little bit of inquiry on this, but because of the injunction, we have not done any particular, we have not delved into this a great deal. So it's your understanding then that the state board simply hasn't delved into this a great deal. Is that right?
I think what's in my report is consistent with this, that they're unaware of any that they know to qualify.
Yes, and they're unaware of any because they haven't delved into it a great deal. Is that right?
Yes, that's what she's saying.
Okay. Now, in preparing your report in this case, you did not review plaintiff's complaint, correct?
I don't believe I did, no.
Okay, so I'd like to pull up the complaint LX 179 and bring it and go to paragraph 64. We could blow that up a little bit. And it's talking in this paragraph about public housing authorities. It says, start with the sentence that says some, such as the Burlington Housing Authority, the Hertford Housing Authority, and the Redevelopment Commission of the Town of Tarboro, provide a picture ID for all their residents over a certain age. You don't have any reason to doubt that assertion, do you?
I have no reason to doubt that, no.
And then the complaint also says other public housing authorities that do not currently put a photograph on its residential IDs would be willing to do so in an effort to assist its residents in voting. Is that right?
That's what is highlighted, yes.
And you don't have any reason to question that assertion, do you?
I don't, no.
Okay, and if we go up the sentence before the first sentence we read, there are 70 housing authorities across the state of North Carolina, and recipients of assistance from these authorities are disproportionately low-income women and people of color. And you have no reason to question those allegations, do you?
I have no basis to dispute that.
Now, we can take that down. Now, SB 824 allows for the use of out-of-state driver's licenses for voters who register within 90 days of an election, correct?
That is correct.
And as we discussed, your voter registration file was from October 17th, 2020. You did not check your no-match list to see how many had registered within 90 days of the November 2020 election, correct?
I did not do that, no. The issue with out-of-state IDs is that there's no centralized database of all out-of-state IDs. To make matters even more complicated, migration into North Carolina doesn't just come from one state, it comes from a large number of states. And so given the number of people involved, trying to get the DMV databases from all of those states, essentially a non-starter.
But you didn't check the voter registration file to see the potential pool of people who would be eligible to use an out-of-state driver's license, correct?
I don't believe I calculated the number of people who registered in that time period.
And you do not know the racial breakdown of voters who registered within 90 days of the November 2020 election, correct?
That would be also true.
All right, now let's talk a bit about the matching procedure that you used. And I think as you testified on your direct, you did not have a unique identifier like a 9-digit social security number that you could use to match these databases. Is that right?
There was no perfectly unique identifier that was available for all the voters in the voter file. So there were things that were close, but not quite that.
Okay, and so you constructed composite matching fields to conduct your analysis. Is that right?
I did. One of the fields, as you saw earlier, was actually not technically a composite field. It was simply a driver's license number.
Okay. And if I say composite matching fields, I understand that technical
Yep.
difference, but I'm including the driver's license.
All 11.
So we're
Yeah,
on the same page. Okay. And you had 11 composite matching fields, is that right?
that is right.
And those were based on 8 different individual data fields? And why don't we just bring up paragraph 89? I was going to ask you about it. That's where the fields are listed.
Yeah, so in paragraph 89, 8 fields are listed.
But there were other fields you could have used in addition to these 8. Is that right?
There were some. There were not many, though, that were common both to the voter file and the DMV file.
And your decision to use these 8 fields to construct your composite matching fields was not directly based on data, correct?
So it was based on data in the sense that I did the following. I needed to find component pieces for the match fields, what ended up being these 8 things that were present in both the voter file and the DMV file. That's a key consideration. The other key consideration was to use match fields that provided high uniqueness of the composite match fields.
Okay, but I guess my question is, and I'll ask it a little differently based on that answer, but the decision of which fields to use to construct your composite matching fields was not based on any empirical data. Is that correct?
So I recall in my deposition that we talked about this question. I believe my response at that point was that I recalled having a conversation with my research assistant about this question, but I didn't recall the details of it at the time of my deposition. After the deposition, I went back and conferred with my research assistant about this, and there were some additional address fields that we could have used. They were things that were not going to be that helpful relative to the fields that we were already using. So having, for instance, the city that someone was in doesn't provide any real additional information over the zip code and the house number, for instance.
Now, was there any empirical analysis you did to determine that using the city field would not be that helpful given the other fields you were using?
We did not look at that explicitly, as I recall. It was more realizing that looking at, say, zip code and house number would not be that different than looking at city, and would in fact be more precise.
Well, house number would not be redundant at all with city, would it?
House number by itself, no. House number with zip code would be similar to looking at, say, city and house number.
And if there was a typo in someone's zip code, the city could add another potential for a match. Is that right?
It could, but again, it's important to note that there are a large number of match strings that don't have any address information at all, and those strings would also catch that sort of person.
Would there be any downside to also using the city if there was a chance that it could catch some people that didn't match on other fields, so long as you kept your uniqueness similar to where you have it already?
So I think that's the main consideration is that by looking at city, in some cases for very small cities, there's less of a concern with uniqueness. For large cities, there would be a larger concern about the loss of uniqueness.
But you simply don't know if you could have constructed some non-redundant fields with city that were of a similar uniqueness to the fields you use. Is that right?
I don't believe that was something that we explicitly did.
If we go to table 2 in paragraph 91, now these are your composite matching fields with their constituent parts. Is that right?
That is correct.
Now, if we go down to table 3, it's on the top of page 29. This shows each of those 11 composite matching fields along with the percent unique. Is that right?
That's correct.
And uniqueness basically measures the extent to which each composite matching field generated matches within the voter file itself. Is that one way to think about it?
I'm not sure that's a helpful way to think about it. So if you look at the caption underneath that table, you can see exactly how uniqueness is defined at let's see, the very last sentence actually. Percent unique is calculated as number of unique records divided by total non-missing records. So I guess second to last sentence, my mistake. So by unique records, one way to think about that is for the composite match string in question, go through all of the roughly 7 million records or so, and calculate the number or the number of unique values of that match string. Divide that by the total number of non-missing records. That's the uniqueness.
Okay, and as the percentage gets closer to 100%, the more unique the composite matching field is. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Now, to construct your composite matching fields, you could have evaluated all non-redundant combinations of your 8 data fields to evaluate their level of uniqueness, correct?
I could have.
But you did not do that, right?
I did not do that explicitly. I did not do that explicitly.
And in fact, you could have evaluated all non-redundant combinations of all the data fields you had available to you across all the databases to evaluate their level of uniqueness. And you didn't do that either, right?
So in principle, I could have. I think that would actually be a very large number of match fields to consider. And given that a number of those are we know are going to be redundant with others, we wouldn't want to sort of go through all of those.
I had non-redundant with
I'm
a
sorry.
condition in my question.
I realized you were doing non-redundant earlier. I thought you lost the
Maybe
non-redundant in that question.
I may have skipped it. It's fine.
No worries, no worries. I did not look at all possible non-redundant combinations.
In fact, you did not test the uniqueness of any other potentially non-redundant composite matching fields. Is that right?
I'm trying to remember. I don't believe so.
So you don't know whether there are additional non-redundant composite matching fields that are at least as unique as your least unique field that you used. Is that right?
I don't know. I don't know that there are, but again, I don't know that there are. The additional information I don't think would add that much, but I don't know for certain.
You don't have any empirical basis for saying that additional information would not add much, do you?
If the question is that something that I attempted to directly evaluate? No. What I'm relying on here is professional judgment and sort of a general understanding of what's happening in the data set, but not something that I've explicitly tested.
You didn't test any other composite matching fields beyond the 11 you used to see if they would turn up additional unique matches in your matching analysis, correct?
I haven't, but the other suggestions that have come in the other experts' rebuttals and elsewhere are all special cases of the match strings I'm using. They wouldn't add any additional matches. So I'm not aware of any. The evidence I've seen suggests that there aren't strings that would add additional matches. I'm not aware of any that there are.
Okay, now let's turn to page 17 of your report in Curry. And this is on page 90 of the PDF. Okay, it looks like we're there.
Okay.
Okay, now in match strings 9 through 12 in Curry, so just to be clear, these are the composite match strings that you used in Curry, is that right?
That's correct.
And you did not design these composite matching fields yourself in that case, is that right?
No, that's correct. Again, in order to use the passport data in the federal ID databases, I had to rely on the federal expert in that case, Dr. Charles Stewart. And as a result, the strings are very similar to what he used.
Okay, so Charles Stewart decided to use these fields, is that right?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay. And I'd like to look in particular at matching fields 9 through 12, and those all involve first initial in combination with other fields, correct?
9 through 12?
Yes.
Yes, that's correct.
And you didn't use first initial in any of your composite fields in this case, right?
I did not, no.
So while you use soundex to attempt to account for spelling variations in last names, you did not use anything to attempt to account for spelling variations in first names, correct?
Sorry, Mr. Patterson, I did not hear the first part. I heard so while you, and then something happened and I did not hear your word. I'm sorry.
I apologize. The question was, in fact, while you used soundex to attempt to account for spelling variations in last names, you did not use anything to attempt to account for spelling variations in first names, correct?
I didn't use first initial. I didn't use soundex for the first name because soundex was not designed for first names. You'll note, though, that if we're looking at match strings 9 through 12, those all have first initial. Every one of those has a corresponding string in my current analysis that doesn't have any first name information at all.
Okay, so your representation is that all of those have matching strings in your present analysis?
To be clear, I'm not claiming that I'm using first initial in the present analysis. My claim is that in my current match strings for this litigation, there's a version of a string that would produce all of the matches one would get by including first initial as in 9 through 12 in the Curry strings, but adding additional matches because first name information is not included.
Okay, and is that the reason why you did not use those strings?
They're redundant, yes.
Just interject at this point. We started back at 1:30 today, and I mentioned earlier in the trial that I like to take a break about every hour and a half. But so when we have a start back at 1:30, sometimes I take 2 short breaks in the afternoon rather than one longer one. So I'm going to go ahead and take about a 10-minute break at this point. Just allow folks to get up, stretch, and that sort of thing. We'll come back. Let's see, that thing says 2:37. Let's come back at 2:47. I know that's an odd time, but it's 10 minutes. 2:47, and we'll start back 2:47.